Oops.
Okay.
There we go. Good morning, Erik, or good evening, whatever time you have.
Good morning, Rhod.
Hey, Paul.
Good to see you again.
Hey, Rhod, how are you?
Everybody?
Good. Hey, Thaima.
Hello.
Thaima.
Thaima.
Hello, good morning. Afternoon, I should say.
I'm going to start sharing my screen, and then I'm not sure how much time you want to give it, Lucinda, until you kick off. But for all the presenters, when you want me to go to the next slide, just let me know. And for everyone here, welcome. If you want to put any of your questions into the chat as presenters are going, we have a Q&A session at the end that your questions will be able to be answered at.
Great. Then I think I will kick off. Ariel, good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome. Please excuse my croaky voice. I have laryngitis, unfortunately, this morning, so bear with me. But I have plenty of talkative people on the panel, so we won't have a difficulty. We won't be short for words, I think. So I'm delighted to welcome everybody to this FIPRA webinar. And I think we certainly have plenty to discuss. We have had a series of very important, very significant elections in Europe, and we're going to delve into some of them today with our excellent panel. And I'm looking forward to those discussions. And we obviously have very important elections looming in the US, and it's been a very eventful couple of weeks in that context, with the withdrawal of the incumbent Joe Biden and the likely ascent of Kamala Harris to the official nomination of the Democratic Party. So really looking forward to the contributions from our panelists. And I think probably the best thing to do is to just go straight in to our first presentation. If you want to pull it up there, Ariel. Great. So we're going to kick off with insights into the US elections, and I'm delighted that Rhod Shaw from FIPRA USA, otherwise known as the Alpine Group Partners, will share with us some slides and some analysis of what is happening and what is likely to happen in the US in the coming months. So Rhod, over to you.
Lucinda, thank you. There's a great cartoon going around in Washington that shows like one of those workplace safety things when you drive in. It says, there's been 0 days since an accident, except this says there are 0 days since the last historic, unprecedented political development. And so at any given moment, things have changed in ways we have not experienced before in the United States. So summarizing what has happened, what is happening, and forecasting what is likely to happen is quite the challenge. But I would start, I think, for what is important for potentially all of you on the call is I thought what I would do is go through and talk a little bit about the focus on something maybe people are not spending time on, which is, are there similarities between what is happening between the Democrats and Republicans if either team is in charge of the White House? What is not likely to change? Then talk about what are things that are likely to change, and to give you a little bit of the lay of the ground of just how tight the American election looks, for reasons that are actually, I want to give you some kind of numbers that I think are interesting. So I wanted to start, knowing we have a limited amount of time, with I think there's some things to recognize, and this is one of the conversations, you can move to the next slide, that that as we have talked across the FIPRA network when everyone was in Washington recently, when we all met in Istanbul, is the rise of populism is a thing. And you can kind of characterize it under anything is big business is a concern for both. You can see things like on this slide where you see that the idea of America first, more isolationist, or at least the desire to avoid international entanglements, is something that actually both teams are talking about. And economically, one of the things I think that results in is you are seeing a fundamental shift in the American political system towards an acceptance of things like tariffs. That era that kicked off somewhere around the Reagan, Bush, Clinton years of free trade agreements and bringing barriers and tariffs down has clearly been reversed in the sense that you see both teams comfortable with a tariff system. As far as you even saw former President Trump mention at one point, maybe we should fund the American tax base off of tariffs instead of an income tax. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's that concept even being stated is kind of a sign of where the American voter, or where at least the parties think the American voter is more comfortable. The other part is drawing out of, the pandemic and the shock to the system that every market experienced with the problems of supply chain has played itself out here too. And, one of the things both parties talk about is how they are not going to get caught in that situation again in the future. And that has an interesting dynamic because it has driven our IRA program and our IIJA program, I think drove a lot of other markets, a lot of other countries to adopt their own. They had their own reasons for doing it, but I think the US effort was also a bit of a precipitator there. But what it's also then done is raise the question of who are your friends that you can count on? Where is friend shoring in this environment? Because a lot of markets and a lot of countries that we have had very close relationships with, you can see both parties kind of going, well, it's great to, let's use the UK as an example, a long historic trade partner, but it's not that it's about the UK or not, it's about we just want it here. Whether that's chip manufacturing, whether that's pharmaceutical manufacturing, whether that's mineral extraction, it doesn't matter what it is. It almost doesn't matter now who your long-term friend has been, as the country really thinks about, we're just not going to get caught in that. And again, that is less of a Democrat-Republican division than something that is unified. So at a time you are reading or hearing so much about division, I just point out there are some large macro themes that I think are aligning. Now, let's be clear. There are massive differences in the psychology, I think, between the two parties that are at stake right now. And a lot of them are driven around what I call a cultural posture. So when you look at the parties' interest, support, or concern about diversity and equity and inclusion, all those kinds of issues clearly are a flashpoint of difference between the two parties. When you look at things like reproductive rights and abortion and that issue, clearly a major division. When you look at climate and you look at the drive to green everything that the Biden administration really has embraced in regulatory policy as well as other direct economic policy, again, a real difference. And what we are going to see in the United States, I think, in 2025, because the Trump tax cuts expire, is as we look to establish our next tax framework, who controls the White House is going to have a very different look in that. I think Democrats want to looking at kind of the uber rich and corporate America paying more. And I think the Republicans are looking at a much more spread tax cut environment. And so for any company operating in the US, that corporate tax fight is going to be, I think, have very stark differences between Democrat and Republican principles. And then I end with one that is interesting, because if you had asked me 10 years ago which party was going to be more closely aligned with defending all that is happening in Israel, you would have said it was the Democrats in general. And now you have a very strong schism, which I saw play out literally outside my window when Netanyahu spoke here this week, and the Palestinian led protests were literally right out this window. You know, it's interesting to see a shift between where now the Republicans are more apt to be defending engagement in Israel, and Democrats being significantly more concerned. So I just wanted to highlight, and again, there's a lot here to cover, and we're trying to do this in 10 minutes, but I wanted to highlight some similarities, some differences, because then if we can move to the next slide, I wanted to talk about really trying how to handicap this election and to prove to you how unprecedented times are. I wrote the slide 2 days ago, and these numbers are already off. So, you know, you are already seeing the change with replacing Biden for Harris having a statistical important change, but I would actually argue right now a larger psychological change in the American voters. And it works in the following way as I see it. The Republicans felt, leading up to the point while Biden was still the nominee, very comfortable that Trump was going to win. I think they were looking at polling numbers across those tier of states I put in the left-hand side. Democrats basically cannot win a White House without tier one in their column. In the Electoral College, those are states they have to deliver. And in those states, Trump was leading Biden, and in some cases by really statistically relevant numbers. All of a sudden, with the change into Harris and the energizing of the Democratic base, it was really kind of just in a walking malaise. You now see that those poll numbers in those states are now starting to even up a bit. And what forecasters are now wondering is, does Harris energize in those three particular states the large urban cores that may now be more excited to vote for first female, woman of color? Does that actually drive turnout? So in Wisconsin, Milwaukee has a significant impact on the election. Michigan, obviously, Detroit has that. Pennsylvania, Philadelphia has a significant play. And I want to talk to you about really why a little bit of enthusiasm makes a difference. In 2020, the margin for victory for the president in Wisconsin was 20,000 votes. That means 10,000 voters shifting their view one to the other would have switched the outcome of the presidential election. In Michigan, it's 150,000. That sounds like a lot, but in, again, a state of millions, that's actually a very small percentage. And in Pennsylvania, it was 80,000. And when you actually add up tier one and tier two, just again to give you an idea of just how little the numbers make such a massive impact on Electoral College, the difference of votes in those those two tiers, was 308,000 votes in 2020. That's less than 1% of the American voting voter base. So less than 1% impacted the outcome of 6 states, which impacts the outcome of this election. So what we're watching is, you may not be waiting to see, wow, Harris hasn't suddenly leapt ahead of Trump by 7 points in a state, or Trump isn't ahead by 7. It's not going to work that way in those states. It is going to come down to a very small number, tens of thousands of voters in those key states that are going to determine the outcome of this election. So one of the other questions we have is this final bullet you have right there, which is, it is also interesting that there's kind of no doubt who will win the popular vote in the United States. In 2020, Biden won the popular vote by 7 million votes. 7 million. Again, I just told you the outcome of the election was predicated on 308,000 voters because of the way the Electoral College works. Harris will obviously do well, but running up numbers in California doesn't really make a difference on the Electoral College. So it will be interesting to see, does where she actually really encourage turnout California, New York, Illinois, states like that, they were already going to go for the Democrats. Yes, it pumps the generic ballot, and yes, it pumps the final popular vote, but will that translate into, again, does she deliver more votes than what we saw Biden was going to do in tier 1 and tier 2? So that is something we will be watching very closely. Next slide, if we could, please. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about mood between the two parties, because there is a palpable difference in talking with House members, senators, political operatives, et cetera, between the day before Biden was still in and the day after. Democrats really, again, were kind of walking in a fog with very little voter enthusiasm, very little institutional enthusiasm. There was a concern that the narrative about just, not that people didn't like Joe Biden, but that he was just too old, was really dampening turnout today. If you now look at the manifestations of excitement for Democrats, you see it in these record-setting Zoom calls that she has been doing. You are seeing it in all these kind of groups popping up of pick your group now for Harris. Those kind of things were just not happening for Joe Biden. That enthusiasm that was not out there, and the money that suddenly started pouring in. And you can always, you can take people's words for it or not, but you're seeing hundreds of millions flow into this campaign in a week. That is something that Democrats just not have. But Democrats are also realists in the sense that they are looking at what Harris, when she ran in the primary for president on her own, didn't do well. There has been a general narrative about kind of, so what has she done as vice president? Does that immigration, does the border issue hang with her? How does she work through that? There are going to be challenges she's going to end up having to address. So if you talk about the mood for Democrats, a lot of what is in their mind is, please deliver the way we think you can. Rise to the opportunity and give us the overall message that we think you can deliver that will make us happy. On the Republican side, there was a general confidence that they felt very good about Trump winning in January. So now the question becomes, things have tightened up statistically. You can see it in the polls and you can feel it in the mood. So what they're hoping is you talk to them. And again, I'm just repeating what I hear. This is not necessarily my personal view. What I hear from Republicans is, let's hope some of the rhetoric around January 6th, or I'm only going to be a dictator for one day, that those kind of rhetoric die down and he sticks to the larger messages they think has resonated with voters, which is, in my manifestation of, look what Democrat-controlled cities have looked like. Look at the homeless problem, look at crime problem, look at the economic shift out of cities in many cases. And look, do you want to bring what they're doing there to the rest of the country? And to try to stay on that kind of, I am going to make America great message of a robust economy, businessman, savvy guy, and to stay in that lane. So each team sees strengths in their candidates, and each of them is also hoping that they can rise to the occasion to find that 1-2% that makes up that 300,000 voters that they need to find in those key states to work. And then I wanted to include that one chart on the left here, just because I think this is interesting. We also have to remind ourselves, and this is the question I struggle with often looking at the American political scene, is Republicans have their base and they're very locked in. Democrats have their base now and they're very locked in. The question is, who are the undecided voters? And they're not many, right? Statistically, there's not many people who don't know, but it is what topic is going to speak to them. Not what's going to fire up your base, but what speaks to them. And what I thought was interesting is when you look at this chart, the number one issue for undecideds is not, for example, abortion. Yet when you talk to Democrats, that is an issue they feel is really a winner for them to energize voters. That may be true for their base, and if this is a base turnout election, that works for them. But if they're trying to find the 1 or 2% of undecideds, abortion doesn't seem to show up so much. When Republicans say it's about immigration, again, it doesn't necessarily show up for the undecideds for them. It is more about, talk to me about, what's happening in my pocketbook. Talk to me about my job. And so that's why I thought that chart was particularly interesting. With that, I know we're trying to keep to kind of 10 minutes at a pop. And so I think that's about 10 minutes. And so I will pause there. I do look forward to either questions, comments that come up down the line, but I wanted to close with one final thing. The parity in the voter of America just blows my mind, that in 325 million Americans, we are down to 300,000 people making a decision on who our president. And there's one other statistic that shows just truly how evenly decided we are. Control of the House of Representatives, no matter how much gerrymandering you think any team has done, et cetera, is going to boil down to 22 toss-up seats. And guess what? 11 of those are held by Republicans and 11 of those are held by Democrats. Everything in this country, when you break down elections, is literally 50-50. Even control of the House with all the variables of different states, different district plans, et cetera. So we are an evenly divided country, and everything is going to hinge on a very small margin of voters, many of whom are not your typical voter. They do not vote in every election. And so they are hard to find and they are hard to understand because they are not your persistent voter. So with that, Lucinda, maybe I'll pause and toss the mic over.
Excellent. Thank you. Really interesting presentation. I think you've distilled what is a pretty complex scenario into a couple of slides very effectively, and there will be lots of questions, I think, arising from that, but we're going to hold them until we get to the end of our initial presentations. So thanks, Rhod. And now I'm going to move on to Erik Jonnaert, who is our colleague with FIPRA International, based in Brussels. So he's going to give us the inside track, I think, from all that's been happening in the EU institutions in recent weeks. So Erik, over to you.
Thank you, Lucinda, and thanks, Rhod, for the insights on what's coming up in the US. When I will now cover the outcome of the elections of the European Parliament, and we can go to the next slides. Perhaps for those of you who are living outside Europe, just a short reminder, of course, EU is not a country like the US. I mean, when we talk European Union, we talk a union of 27 member states, and their policy is driven by three institutions: European Commission, who is proposing a policy and legislation, and then you have the co-legislators, the European Parliament on the one hand, and the European Council, with representatives of these 27 member states and their governments on the other hand. So the elections for 720 seats in the new European Parliament have taken place in each of those 27 EU member states between June 6 and 9. And it must be said that it had the highest turnout of all European Parliament elections so far, with more than 51 of the voters who participated. And it's interesting to note that, in fact, this is 51% of a big electorate. It's, in fact, the second largest democratic electorate in the world after India, 375 million people who could vote. Now, they are organized, these European Parliament elections, at national level, and in each country there's a different number of seats to be elected, reflecting the demographics of each country. So bigger countries like Germany are entitled to 96 seats, France 81 seats, Italy 76 seats, while smaller countries like Ireland only is entitled to 14 seats in the European Parliament, or Hungary 21 seats. So citizens vote for national political parties, who are also the ones involved in national elections. But then those political parties at national level have created European political formations. Some established political groups, like the European Christian Democrats, EPP, European People's Party, or the Socialists or the Greens, or others have come together after these elections to form a new political formation, and that was the case for the extreme right parties, which are very different across the European Union, but who created at least one of those groups is the Patriots for Europe, which now has become the third biggest political group with 11.7% of all seats. Now, even if the right-wing political parties across Europe won lots of seats in this new European Parliament, elected for the next 5 years, it also has to be said, the big winner were the Christian Democrats, holding now 26.1% of all seats, which is more than before. Before they had 25%. Yeah. So the victory was for the Christian Democrats. Socialists came second with 18.9% of the seats, which is down from the 20% plus they had before. Patriots for Europe, which is this new formation created by Viktor Orbán of Hungary with his Fidesz party, but where you have especially a big contingency from France, Marine Le Pen's political party, the FN, the Patriots for Europe, form the third biggest formation now with 11.7% of the seats, followed by another right party group, European Conservatives and Reformists, or ECR, which are more moderate right, but with, among others, Giorgia Meloni's party. So they have 10.8% of the seats, and then followed by others like Renew, to which Macron's party belonged, the Greens, and the left. Now, there is a coalition of the Christian Democrats, the Socialists, and the Liberals, supported by the Greens, who together have avoided that the extreme right would take any of the chairs of the European Parliament committees who matter. And they also secured the election of the new president for the European Parliament, which is Roberta Metsola from the EPP, and also the election of the new Commission president, again Ursula von der Leyen from Germany, but also from the Christian Democrats. And if you look at the different chairs of the different important committees in the Parliament, you see the bulk of those chairmanships go to the Christian Democrats, followed by the Socialists, Renew, even the Greens. And if you look at the nationality of those chairs, 7 come from Germany, 3 from Spain, 3 from Poland, only 2 from France, and only 2 from Italy. So that's a bit the outcome of these elections. What will happen next is the Commission President von der Leyen has now invited all governments to present 2 candidates for commissioners. You may know that in the Commission there are 27 commissioners, each for each member state, 1 for each member state. So each member state has been asked to present 2 candidates by end of August, and then these will be presented by von der Leyen to the European Parliament in September, to be followed by hearings, because these commissioners will be screened, or these candidate commissioners will be screened in the European Parliament before there is going to be a vote in the Parliament on the investiture of the Commission. Yeah? And as mentioned, the far right has definitely made a lot of progress in these elections. Polls have indicated that when people voted for the far right parties, it was not necessarily because they agreed with the manifestos of these extreme right parties, but they disagreed with the other parties. So it's more a vote for change, I would say. Now, what is important to note is the dominant presence of extreme right among MEPs from the big countries. If you look at the members of European Parliament from Germany, 14 are from the extreme right. If you look at France, 30 members of the European Parliament come from the extreme right. In Italy, it's 24. In Poland, it's 20, which means that they form important blocs which could reject proposals made by their government, because except for Italy, where you have Meloni as prime minister, belonging to the ECR, one of the far-right parties, none of the other extreme right parties are in the government. So we may expect some controversial discussions, especially between the institutions within the parliament, but also between parliament and council in the future. Now, contrary to what we've seen from Rhod in the US, we have a discussion between blue and red. Europe is multicolor, is a mosaic of party colors, which makes political decision-making extremely challenging and difficult. Now, that raises the question, what is next? What can we expect from this new European Parliament? And I want to share you 3 scenarios, because at the end of the day, we will have to wait and see how this plays out. The first scenario is one which is very likely to happen, which we could call a scenario of an enlightened pragmatism, where you will see different coalitions being formed. And in that respect, the Christian Democrats, who have the most of the seats in the European Parliament, will definitely be the kingmaker. But you could see coalitions led by the EPP and choosing allies from different political groups, depending on the issues at stake. The second scenario, the following slide, is the one which I would call rallying the flag. If, of course, Europe would experience to be challenged, be it by Russia, be it by China, be it by the US, depending on the outcome of the elections, you could see this as triggering a unifying factor across political groups to act to act in favor of a strong European agenda, especially in areas like industrial policy, especially in areas like security, and in areas like defense, even if the European Parliament has not much to say on the latter. And then you have the third scenario, scenario 3, next slide, which hopefully will not materialize, which is especially a scenario based on the hypothesis that especially the right-wing parties would start to play a dominant role in the European Parliament. That is one where you would see a risk of erosion from within, whereby especially upon the pressure of the right-wing parties, the political agenda at European level would be challenged, and where you would see eventually a move back to the power of the nations and the government against a unique common European approach. That is where I would say we are at this stage. We have to wait until the new European Parliament comes back after summer, which is as from September. And we can expect already some interesting debates coming up during the hearings of the candidate commissioners, which will take place as from September and in October. That's from the European Union side.
Excellent. Thank you so much. As you say, it certainly is a mosaic and a lot to consider, I think, as we, as public affairs professionals, look to the next 5 years in member states and at EU level. So thank you for that overview, and we will certainly come back with some further discussion during the remainder of this webinar. So I think that leads very nicely. You've mentioned France and even the numerically diminished presence of the French in the European Parliament in terms of committee chairs, etc. And obviously, all of this is linked to elections which have taken place recently in France. So I'm delighted to ask Thaima Samman, who is representing FIPRA France, Salmon Law and Corporate Affairs, where she's the principal, to talk about and give us some of her analysis on the situation in France, the recent elections, and what next. So Thaima, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. And if I can, following up on Rhod mention of a changing world, certainly in the months to come, if the US, as we are in the Olympics at the moment, could win the gold medals in terms of uncertainty and impact in the Western world, France could be a challenger to go into the podium for one of the two other medals with what we have been through since June 11. You rightly mentioned that we went through national elections, but they were not expected and they came as a surprise. And since June 11, we have been on a kind of a roller coaster of a new situation, unexpected results, and we are kind of on a break because of summertime and the Olympics. So everybody calms down after the first episode of the first season. But you should expect a new season with new episode as for probably middle of August or beginning of September. So as I was saying, the French president called for new legislative elections, which was totally unexpected. As we are not a parliamentarian regime, the dissolution of National Assembly of the French Parliament is pretty rare and has to be justified. And it was certainly not the right time for him to call for new elections. And proof is in the pudding. These new elections didn't clarify anything on the French situation. On the contrary, probably give some more confusion. But at the same time, and that's something I would like to pause for 1 minute, the current French situation is probably going from afar, from at least the 2017 and a few years even before, with the election of Emmanuel Macron, which was probably the symbol of a transformation of the political landscape with political parties which didn't represent anymore the reality of the French populations and how they were working. I'm not going to go too deep into that because we don't have time, but nevertheless, this newcomer coming from nowhere and disrupting the traditional parties was certainly the symbol of something going on in France, which hasn't been concretized with Emmanuel Macron presidency, which happened to be, at the end of the day, a very traditional politicians and probably less talented than the one we are used to have. So he was re-elected from some objective and probably external reasons, but nevertheless, we didn't go up to what his first election means, and we are probably now in this situation. So I've just put in the slide the situation of the French National Assembly at the moment. So just as a reminder for the one, well, or just for you to be aware that we have two chambers, but the most important one is the National Assembly, the one which has the last say in all legislative debate, so the core of the political majority. And let me also explain that contrary to a lot of other European countries, we are not a parliamentarian regime. We are so we are not used to coalition. So the situation that you are looking at wouldn't be a surprise or an issue in Germany, Spain, Belgium, even Italy, But in France is a very new situation. We are a presidential, a kind of less democratic than the US presidential regime, with a president which is used to have an absolute majority, or with a coalition having a clear and absolute majority in our period of cohabitation, but with the capacity to have a head of government with a prime minister replacing the power of the president. Nothing like that at the moment, as we don't have any group representing a majority. Even the left part, I've seen the title, which looks sexy and clear, which is not totally the truth of the French situation, as the left coalition didn't get an absolute majority, as you can see, from the red to the purple, but are also very fragmented. And our culture is not for politicians to find compromise. So the new situation may be that France is going through a change of paradigm, and probably for the optimist one, a kind of maturity in terms of finding compromise to better represent the French population. If we go to the next slide. So the situation today, but again, expect new episode, is that we have a government, a prime minister who have resigned, and a resigned government, which is still governing until the president name a prime minister. And here again, we are a bit different from other European countries. Prime minister and head of government is not an emergence of the majority at the parliament, is a choice of the president. He can name my mother if he wants to. Wouldn't be very smart, but he can do it at least. So it's his choice to nominate a prime minister, and we had in the past certain situations where the prime minister was not a member of parliament, but a person coming from from the high administration or the academic world. So it's not a new situation, and Macron can do whatever he wants, which provoke a kind of situation with the left coalition, which is the first strength within the parliament, fighting to and asking to have the head of government, but with no constitutional background. Actually, the real surprise of the election was the score of the extreme right, that everybody was expected to be leading the elections. Question being, will they have an absolute majority or not? They are the third force. And this situation is due to the decision to the resigned or acting prime minister to renew what has been on in France for years with the emergence of the extreme right, called le Front Républicain, the Republican Front, excluding the extreme right for coalition in the second round of the legislative election, and for some organizational reasons, institutional reasons, not able to get the job of member of parliament, because all the other force having a coalition against them. So we thought that this organization was dead because of the president's policy, but the prime minister decided to go against the president and to have an agreement with the left to prevent the extreme right to reach a majority and to be the first strength within the parliament. And what is also the surprise of the second round of the legislative election is in France, is the reaction of the French people, with a level of a participation rate that France hasn't reached for years, with more than 66% of the population voting for the second round, meaning that people who didn't vote for the first round came to vote for the second round against the extreme right. So an issue for the extreme right with almost 70% of the population ready to vote for anybody but them. And we have seen people from the extreme left calling for the vote for the Home Office Minister, known for his very conservative and securitarian position. So something new that we all learn at this moment. So what is, if you can come back to the last slide, please. So we have a government handling the day-to-day business until Macron decides to name a new prime minister who will be in charge of appointing a government, which is likely not to happen before the end of the Olympics. What we don't know if Macron is talking about the traditional Olympic or the Paralympic, which means between August 15 and September 11. So some time to think about it. My personal guess is that he can't wait for September 11. It's too long because we have the budget to come. So if we can go now to the next slide. So the three scenarios possible at the moment is as nobody wants to form an official coalition, but the traditional rights, the member of the EPP at the European level have already said that they won't participate to a government, but could be ready to support some legislations at the National Assembly on a case-by-case situation. So a weak government with personalities or coming from the outgoing majority with a few initiatives and the center of power going to the National Assembly with legislation negotiated on a case-by-case. An Italian or Spanish-style solutions with government of experts or minority government trying to hold the situation as they can, or, but very unlikely, a new Popular Front left coalition government or lead by this coalition, but very unlikely as the president has made very clear that he doesn't want this solution. And because they don't have a majority on themselves, and I've already explained that they don't want to compromise with other group. But a lot of new episodes can come and they can change their mind. So this is mainly the situation. And if we can go to the next slide, because I think I'm nearly close to over time. So what's going to happen in the coming month? So a new government week, probably a very weak one, with some important steps to come, starting with the adoption of the budget and a few other emergency. But what is very likely to not only to happen, but to continue, because it has already been the same since 2022, is the power will stand with administration, with high civil servants leading some very important administration, deciding and obtaining signature from the government, with a specificity, a French specificity, which is that in our country, the regulation is a rule and legislation an exception. And it's listed in the Constitution. So the administration has a lot of margin of power, in addition to the fact that they also have the margin of maneuver of legislation implementation with a lot of possibilities. And we have a broad legislative corpus in addition from European regulations, which are legislation with direct implementation force, with which they can play. So we can be run by the European Union somehow in some cases, but we have also workable tools to do that. In addition, and to finish with this, and I will be happy to explain more in details how we can work. We also have some specific rules to adopt the budget. So we are not in a situation, we are not in the US-like situation with a potential shutdown, as at the end of the day, the constitutions give to the government, to the executive power, a lot of tools to overcome the parliament, to have the necessary budget adopted, if not a consistent budget, which is not going to be an easy situation. As you know, France is one of the more in-depth countries, budget deficit country. So not easy to find its way to navigate into the situation, but still with a bit of French imagination, nothing's impossible. Probable scenario, possible scenario that need to be kept in mind is that the president has the possibility to call for new legislative elections once a year. Nobody has done that ever. I think we had 3 or 5 anticipated legislative elections in 50 years, sorry. So, but if the situation is too complicated, we can go to the voting station. You can go back to French people can go back to the voting stations on June 9, 2025. So stay tuned. New episode to come, maybe new season to come. We are not over yet. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thaima. That's really interesting. I think outside of France, the commentary was very much that people could breathe a sigh of relief. The far right didn't win, but obviously it's a heck of a lot more complex than that. And I think you've explained it very well in terms of the options and what may or may not happen in the coming weeks. So thank you, and we will come back to it. I'm going to move on now to Paul McGrade from Lexington Communications in London, who's going to share his insights into the recent UK elections and the priorities of the new Labour government in the UK. Paul.
Thanks, Lucinda. Hi, everyone. I'll try and be brief because on 4th of July, the Labour Party won a huge majority in the UK election after 14 years out of office. And just to give you an idea of the scale of that, the opposition Conservative Party have been reduced to their lowest number of seats since 1832. So unlike previous colleagues, I'm not going to show you the seats, the makeup of the parliament, that kind of thing, because we don't need to worry about that. All politics for the next 5 years in the UK will effectively take place within the Labour Party. So it's important to understand what's driving them and what constrains them and what they're looking to achieve. So, as I said, 14 years they've been out of office. So this is an inexperienced government. And the world's changed a lot since 2010 when they were last in power. So whether it's China, the strains on the US alliance, war in Europe, or our theme today, Nation First World, a new set of ministers, almost none of whom have been in government before, are trying to grapple with this new world. And that's a world in which the UK is going to increasingly have to choose who it aligns with and which big regulatory blocks it gets closer to. So that's one big constraint. This new UK government has a huge majority, but it has no money. So that's the other big constraint. So the top priority for the Labour government is growth and investment. And the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and Rachel Reeves, his new Finance Minister, don't think that they can get re-elected in 4 or 5 years' time without some real evidence of growth. And they'll be pretty ruthless in trying to achieve that within certain political limits. And when you look at the inheritance that they have, the public finances in a mess, national debt is 100% of GDP. The UK has much more index-linked debt than any G7 country, so it's much more subject to inflation pressures. So there's very little money. There's going to be no Inflation Reduction Act here. Instead, Labour's offer to business is going to be around liberalising planning for construction. It's going to be about opening up sustainable energy production, so granting more licenses for on and offshore wind and solar. And it's going to be about offering political and economic stability. And part of that is a closer and more stable relationship with the EU. Now that reset, as Starmer talks about with the EU, has limits. Starmer has been very clear that the UK is not going to seek to rejoin the EU single market or customs union, nor accept free movement of people. So those are real constraints, of course, on what may be deliverable with the EU, but they're real political constraints in the UK, because it's Labour now who has this broad electoral coalition that includes a large number of people who voted to leave the EU in 2016. And Labour's strategy, I think, within those constraints will be to test the EU appetite and flexibility for as close a relationship as possible. We've got some early clues around that. They've talked about potentially aligning with EU chemicals regulations, certainly aligning with carbon pricing and a carbon border adjustment mechanism. The government's legislative programme is going to include broad powers for ministers to align quickly with EU regulation in products markets without coming back to Parliament in any substantive way. And in terms of the machinery of government, the EU relationship is being put back at the centre of government in the Prime Minister's office, effectively the Cabinet Office. So they will be coordinating across all the government ministries what they want from an EU renegotiation and doing some of that arbitration between the competing demands. That's the strategy. I think tactically, Labour understands that it needs to focus on, before it gets to trade, it needs to focus on security first. And they've defined security really broadly, right, to include migration, to include energy, and even health. So they are pushing this idea of a security pact, a formal treaty ultimately is the aim, but even a non-binding declaration initially with the EU to get into those broad issues where they think there are a lot of shared interests. And then they hope that the goodwill that that generates will lead into a substantive reopening of the trade deal. But they understand that anything on trade in goods is probably going to be deep into 2025 or more likely 2026. And even the security offer is a 2025 discussion in substance, assuming it happens. In the meantime, Labour may offer unilateral alignment with EU rules in particular sectors, and we're seeing clues about that already coming out in terms of business engagement with the Labour government. So whether business wants that or not in specific sectors, they should be engaging soon with this Labour government. I talked to some former colleagues who are leading parts of the renegotiation preparations. They said that process across the government departments will be really kicking off properly in October. So we're advising clients to be engaging by late September with the UK government on specific things that they want or things that they don't want, and to frame that in terms of growth, because that's what this government really cares about and feels it will live or die by. So between the growth imperative and a potential EU renegotiation, and certainly some unilateral repositioning by the UK, there are big opportunities here for business. So, for example, UK companies can't provide on and offshore wind or solar tech at scale. They're going to need that investment from outside. The UK is keen to get into EU defence procurement, which is obviously not in its gift, but the companies will be looking to kind of build those links. There's the potential that lots of sectors could realign with EU rules dynamically, as the jargon has it. So following the detail as the EU updates or changes its regulations. And that potentially, at least the government hopes, will improve market access. But even where there is going to be divergence, that is commercially potentially quite interesting, because that will be a conscious choice and probably in quite limited fields. So there's a lot to play for with this new UK government, and there's an open door if you or your clients can offer a credible path, a credible story about growth and investment that could be brought to the UK. Look, I'm going to stop there, Lucinda, conscious of time. That's a real whistle stop tour, but hopefully we can get into more detail in the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. And really interesting to get your initial thoughts on the direction of the new government. And I'm sure that some of our attendees will have some questions around all of that as we go. We have, I think, about 30 minutes for our discussion. And I just want to encourage participants to share questions through the chat if you would like. I have one question already, which is to ask, going back to you, Ron. You've been quiet for a while, so we'll throw it back to you for a moment. And the question is, what a renewed Trump presidency or Harris presidency would mean for relations with China and a possible trade war in that context, and then for transatlantic relations. They're probably questions that I think we all would like to hear answered. So over to you if you'd like to take that one on, Rhod.
Sure. That actually goes back maybe to the similarities bucket a bit, in that if there are very few bipartisan areas of, let's call it, alignment, and that is right now it is very safe to be anti-China in American politics, and both parties feel that way. How that has played out is a question. There is no doubt in my mind that regardless of whether we're talking about 2024 or 2025, you're going to see a tariff policy from the U.S. on Chinese products. You are also going to see, and this is important for European companies, I think you're going to continue to see a lot of focus on export controls. And that really boils down to, in many ways, what's going on in the semiconductor chip realm. We spend a lot of time working with ASML and the large chip manufacturers, and the dynamics over what new technologies can go into China, what historic, let's call it, lower value technologies, what's going on in the AI world, is just draws a lot of bipartisan support and attention. That when the U.S. Congress developed this Chinese task force for them to look at policies, it is interesting to talk to Republican and Democrat members of that task force, because they're the only happy people I know in Washington talking about working with the other team. They're like, oh, I have this great working relationship with my colleague from the other side of the aisle, and we are finding lots of areas of agreement. So, Russia and the Ukraine divide the parties. That is not something where there is great alignment. China definitely is. There is also, we swing like a pendulum, Lucinda, a bit on how concerned we are about China invading Taiwan as just a political moment. And I would argue right now there is kind of a sense in the American political realm of not likely to happen here in the kind of foreseeable immediate future, and that we're going to see much more of an economic war between the two than we are to see a physical one start. And I don't think anybody really knows for certain, obviously, but there is kind of a sense that people are like, let's ratchet up as much pressure on China as we can. Now, that said, there's one other underlying current here, which is American business is also highly aware minerals or et cetera come from China or other places that are difficult. This goes back to the friendshoring, offshoring question. Pharmaceutical feedstocks come out of China. Like when you start running down the litany of things, there is also kind of the rhetoric, red meat of going, let's go after China hard, with also an understanding of, man, we are really dependent upon them for a lot of things. So the one other way I would answer this question is one of the other components, and we've been spending a lot of time talking to our colleagues from Mexico about this, and actually our Canadian folks, so the Earnscliffe and Juan Mauricio out of Mexico, talking about, are there games to be played, or is there a game worth watching about how do companies deal with China, and do they actually not try to come directly into the US, but do they whitewash, do they at least complicate the supply chain by going into Mexico? Does a Chinese product come to Mexico for assembly? What can pass through Canada and avail itself of the free trade agreement we have in North America? And so, yeah, like everything right now, everything is complicated, but I would say this is one of the few places, again, where I think there's more similarity in outlook than there is division between Democrats and Republicans, regardless of who runs the White House next.
Interesting. I might keep on the China theme for a moment. We have more questions coming in about US positioning, but just on China, it'd be interesting, I think, to hear from some of our European colleagues on the attitudes. Obviously, the US and Europe have been, I won't say poles apart, but have had a different approach. The EU, I mean, some describe it as trying to sort of play both sides or have the cake and eat it. Others would say it's much more pragmatic. But I think the European position on China is hardening, and we've seen that, with theft of intellectual property in Germany, arrests being made, spies being identified, etc. It's quite dramatic, but certainly I think the mood in Brussels and in European capitals is becoming a little bit more hawkish. I presume that's good news, whoever might be the next president and whoever might lead the next administration in the US. But interested to get the thoughts of Erik, Thaima, and Paul on this as well.
Yeah, if I may kick in here. Well, first of all, I mean, Europe is in a different position than US. Europe needs also China in many sectors. So that interdependency of our economy with other markets, including China, is a first fact which we need to take into account, and what is also taken into account by the European Union. That's why the strategy at European level versus China is clearly not one of what we call decoupling, but one of de-risking. Yeah. So trying to find a more balanced middle ground, avoiding a situation that we are too dependent on China by encouraging European companies to invest more in those areas which are considered as of strategic importance to Europe's economy, especially when it comes to the green transition and the digital transition. That's why you see Europe calling now not only for inbound investment screening, but also outbound investment screening, which sounds already more similar to what the US is doing. So this is important. On the other hand, again, China remains an important trade partner. And you see, for instance, this week we have Mrs. Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy, visiting China. She stepped out of the Belt and Road partnership with China, but is trying to see whether trade relations with China can be restored. And in that context, you see a request also from the European Union for a more of a level playing field with China. And that explains also the investigation that the Commission has initiated against electric cars manufactured in China and subsidized by China, to avoid a situation whereby Europe would be invaded by cheap electric cars, even if Europe wants more electrification of road transport. So it's again find this middle ground. I do not think that Europe will follow the US in that respect. You see also national governments taking a very moderate approach. I mentioned Italy. Germany is another example, who depends on China imports for their industry, who are big investors in China. So that middle ground approach will continue to be a headline, I think, in the trade policy that the EU will want to have with China, while insisting of a level playing field, which is fair.
Thanks, Erik. Thaima.
Yes, well, I think what Erik said also corresponds to the spirit in France. I like the allegory of decoupling versus de-risking. The French are very cautious and don't trust the Chinese representative business and government, but they are also, and Macron also went with his government to China to try to discuss trade and to discuss support, to try to have the Chinese step in and moderate the Russians' positions, and to try to have a better playing field in the economic area. France has also launched very quietly, but certainly a lot of program and campaign to warn people in the academics, in the business, in business organizations, for example, on Chinese trying to take strong positions or to be integrating into their organization. And it's, for example, very surprising in the academic sector, because they are usually very open to the international world, but it went to a point that people needed to be apparently warned that you can be as open as you are with other nationalities. So this, as we say in France, je t'aime moi non plus, kind of, we want them, but not in the condition they are at the moment.
Very, very good. Thank you. Paul, the British perspective will be interesting, I think, given the special relationship with the US. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think this is one of these issues, Lucinda, where the UK is really torn and will broadly have to follow, either the EU or the US. And I think everyone expects that the UK will get much closer, will broadly align with EU on trade policy, will probably have a very security-led approach to the issues that are perceived as genuine security risks, like Chinese tech in government and police kind of operating systems, and that there's a broad continuity there with the previous government. But if you take a real-world example, the UK is not going to follow the EU on Chinese EV tariffs, right? The trade minister hasn't given a formal decision yet, but said in the margins of the recent G7 trade ministers meeting that the UK isn't going to raise tariffs on Chinese EVs. And that, I think, reflects this other point about growth. And what's really happened here is that the UK-based car manufacturers have lobbied the government as one, saying, we produce in China for the European market understood geographically. So don't do this. It will really damage growth. So the government isn't going to do it. So this is what I mean about there will be interesting areas of divergence driven by the growth imperative. Now, that's not a million miles away from probably where Germany was, right, in terms of its car industry kind of lobbying the government in Berlin. But there are broader considerations that the Commission took into account about the competition from Chinese EVs, as Erik said. The UK government obviously has that flexibility, but it's a much smaller market. So it's got to expect that, you know, if the US effectively closes its market as it's done on EVs, you know, more of those are going to come the UK's way, and then you've got to be kind of happy with that or ready to accept that. But I think broadly you would expect the UK to be following the EU, but where that growth imperative cuts across it, that's what will come first. And again, this is the kind of conversation we're having with clients now, where we're saying to sectors, if you've got a clear and unified message and can link it very clearly to growth, this government is going to listen because they feel their fate depends on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the parallel with Germany is a good one. Obviously, there are broader considerations and maybe more geographically immediate considerations with in the context of Ukraine and what's happening there with China, Russia, and other proxies. So it's the dynamic is perhaps slightly changing at European level. Excellent. A lot to discuss, and we only have less than 15 minutes left. There is a question about a Trump presidency, and I suppose you know, what it's likely to mean, you know, in terms of the type of policy agenda that would be pursued. Is it a souped up version of MAGA? Is it you know, can we expect Trump 2.0 to be you know, even more, I don't want to say worse, but more inspired by Make America Great Again, and which option is a better option in terms of the US reputation, standing in the world, perception, etc., from your perspective? And I think it would be good to also hear on how the EU is preparing or not preparing for a US Trump presidency from November. So, Rhod, I'll let you kick off, and then I'll ask colleagues to.
Sure. I think the assumption in Washington is that Trump does what he says he's going to do. And there's, you know, and to his base, they love that. And to people that are opponents, they dislike that. And I think he has been pretty transparent about what he wants to focus on, and some of that is economics, and some of that again goes back to my point of kind of it's like it's almost like a cultural shift. So in Washington, where everyone thinks about their own job, you know, his rhetoric and statement that if I come in, I will kind of purge the bureaucracy of the deep state progressive world, I think he probably will try to deliver on that in whatever form or fashion he could do that by suddenly making most everything a political job. I'm always struck when I talk to our FIPRA colleagues about how little the bureaucracy changes when regimes change in other countries. You know, our friends in Germany talk about, you know, like 35 people change jobs. In Washington, 3,000 people change jobs. And actually, if Trump got his way, it'd probably be 10,000. I mean, like there'd be a lot of disruption in that regard. But I think there is a belief that he wants to attack kind of the deep state that he thinks has been after him. There is a general assumption that the Department of Justice, he says, has been weaponized against him. There is a sense he will weaponize it in ways that he can do what he thinks is purging or cleaning. I think other people will think is vindictive or something. So you have that whole genre of activity. You also then have, I think, while there's this push me pull you between what came out with this, agenda for 2025 and is he a part of it, is he not, and so on. I think you can really actually answer a lot of this in a different way, and that is, look at who he picked for his vice presidential nominee. He had the moment to be able to decide to send a signal to his cohorts, voters, and himself. Am I putting somebody around me who thinks differently than me, has a different rhetoric, has a different tendency than I do? Or did he pick somebody that actually doubles down on, I'm going to accept where you want to go, Mr. President, right? He could have softened his image with a different choice. And actually, what I think is, when you hear them talk openly about the lessons they learned from Trump 1.0, was they surrounded themselves with people that did not just say yes. How can I do what you want? They're talking very directly about, this time we're going to have people in the cabinet, we're going to have people in the White House, we're going to have people in every job that are going to be, yes, how high do you want me to jump to accomplish what you want? And so I think it's going to be, if he wins, I think it's going to be a very aggressive Trump 2.0, and I think he will do what he is promising his voters he will do. And that can be bureaucratic, that can be on tax policy, that can be on tariff policy for business. I take him at his word. He has a track record as his first term of doing that. I would also say there is a real interest here in town over, but what will he be able to do in one regard? It's clear the Supreme Court is now in a position to be helpful to him. But I go back to something I said earlier. Control of the Senate is likely to go Republican. The math is very hard for the Democrats to win that. But the Democrats could win the House. And it would be very interesting to watch Trump win and the House flip at the same time. Flip out the presidency and flip out. And again, it'll be by tiny margins. But the House is the engine of where hyperbole and lots of things go, because it is much more reactive than the Senate. If the House was Democrat, it would be interesting to see how Trump navigates a body that will not go along. They'll be unified under, and I think the Democrats, if they have the margin by 1 at 218, they will be much more unified opposition than what the Republicans have had to deal with when they had a 218 seat margin and they had schisms and throwing out speakers. Like, none of that's going to happen with the Democrats. So that would be my kind of complicated way to say, I think he does what he believes. I think the Agenda 2025 may not be his handwriting, but I think there's a lot in there that this group. And I think the vice presidential pick reaffirms what he has said he wants around him to operate in 2025 if he's president.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. His opponents could begin to pine for Mike Pence potentially as a moderating force. I see, Erik, I think you may like to come in on this.
Yeah, well, okay. We don't have a crystal ball, of course, on what will happen and what it will mean, but we can anticipate, obviously, and that's what we should do and what business should do. Clearly, if Trump is reelected with a Trump administration, we can expect more conflictual relations on the trade side. One which was already, I think, announced by Trump is tariffs on import of steel and aluminium, which is currently suspended. So those in Europe exporting steel, aluminium would again be hit, but other exporters as well, because we have heard that Trump would reintroduce 10% import tariff on all imports into the US. So all European companies exporting to the US could be hit. And trade with the US is important. We know currently the business community isn't a big fan of conflicts because they need this trade. They need this good relationship with the US. That's why I know the European business community would like to see a continuation of the dialogue with the US, especially then also the US business community, but also the US administration, by a continuation of what was put in place in the Biden administration, this TTC, this Trade and Technology Council, yeah, which at least provided for a forum for dialogue between the two administrations to discuss certain issues. Yeah, so that's what I see as implication on the trade front. The second part will be, of course, on the defense front. Yeah, but you already see now in the NATO context, especially the EU countries stepping up in investing in defense, where they were lagging behind, and rightly so. They need to step up investment. But if we would see Trump focusing too much on the US economy only, this could have an effect in Europe, also for the defense industry in Europe, rallying around an agenda to invest more in Europe's economy, in Europe's defense industry, which would obviously help Europe being more competitive in this area. Because like in UK, growth and competitiveness is also going to be high on the agenda of next European Commission and next European Parliament, as already announced by Ursula von der Leyen. And so, on the one hand, you have then in the US somebody saying, make America great again. We know already now that some of the extreme right parties have copy-pasted that mantra by saying we need to make Europe great again, and especially the right-wing parties within the Patriots for Europe, which counts among others the RN from France, are in favor of such an approach. And I think the more aggressive you would see a US administration against allies, the more aggressive you could think Europe could become, especially under pressure of the right-wing parties.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have less than 4 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you maybe to bring it back to your own markets. It's been interesting to discuss China and the transatlantic dynamic, but Thaima, a very interesting few weeks and months ahead in France. And maybe if you could just maybe wrap up by focusing on how you're going to help clients navigate that, or how best to prepare for this turbulent phase in French policymaking.
Well, the first things that we have been doing and that we are going to, what is very interesting in what's going on in France is why the politics and politicians looks like they are playing in a playground while the adults are continue to work and do what they have to do. Because again, our constitutions and our institutions at the end of the day doesn't give that much power to the parliament and for the professional politicians, and more to the administration, services and other institutions. So first things for us is to explain that going to see the president or minister may not be the more efficient way to obtain and to discuss the policy we have to discuss. And as a matter of fact, this is no news. This has been the case for a long time, that in my country, you deal what you have to deal, you discuss, you engage with the people who have the more impact, and usually they are not at the parliament level. At the parliament level, you have more of the hot discussions, the one that do not make consensus, the one they like to fight about rather than find solutions. So that is not going to change much, apart from a certain level of issues. So the accompaniment needs to be requires a strong knowledge of how the institution works and how to navigate with them, who decides what on at which moment. The timeline is also very important, and being able to discuss and negotiate with the people who can make a decision. That's a common mistake in public affairs to go to the people that are eating the headline that may not be the one who decide on your specific issue. So that we are going to explain how it works. We are ourselves in a kind of uncertainty. We are policy and politics experts. So the people who are telling you what is going to happen are just not very good, because it's impossible to know. We know the element of the equation. We have some unknown elements which can totally change the organization. We just need to look, analyze, and adjust according to the evolutions, and again work with the people who have an impact on the specific issues we are dealing with.
Great, thank you, Thaima. Seeing as we're just on the half hour, I'm going to just ask Paul, because you didn't have an opportunity to get in on the last point. So I'll ask you to wrap up if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lucinda. I mean, in engaging with the new UK government, it really comes down to these two things about what can you offer them on growth and investment, and then secondly, what do you want or not want from a potential EU renegotiation. And on the growth point, we're saying to people, there's no money. You obviously have a powerful government with a huge majority. In theory, they can do whatever they want in legislative terms, but they've already set out a very big legislative program for what's probably going to be the first 2 years of this government. So front load that kind of engagement with things that you want that can be done quickly, like through the regulator, through secondary legislation that don't cost a huge amount of money, and then get to the more difficult stuff potentially that where you want the government to match funding or pump prime innovation or whatever it is. But these are two ways in which the government are trying to shake up the system. They'll see everything through the growth prism. They will have a go at an EU renegotiation. So help them, show how you can contribute to those objectives, ultimately to growth, and do that pretty soon, because they will start to be captured by the system. They'll start to just get busy with events. And, if there is a substantive renegotiation, that will be a huge project for a UK government, and it will take up a lot of bandwidth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And speaking from experience, I mean, the enthusiasm of a new administration, new government, new ministers, civil servants who feel energized, it diminishes pretty quickly. So so use that opportunity for sure. I'm so sorry, but we have run a little bit over time. I would love to bring everybody back in, but I can't. And I can see that more questions were coming in. What I can say is that all of our experts who joined us today, Rhod, Erik, Thaima and Paul, are available. So, should you want to discuss your issues, your company-specific issues, policy areas, specific legislation with any of us in the FIPRA network, please do go on to our website, take a look, and you'll find our contact details there. And if you would like to reach out to any of us, or indeed from our sister firms in other locations all over the world, to help guide you and navigate through some of these choppy political waters, I know that we would all be delighted to help with that. So I think on that note, I had better wrap up. Unfortunately, I could keep talking and listening all day, but thank you to our excellent panelists, and thank you to FIPRA for organising this event, and thank you to all of the guests who have joined today. We look forward to engaging with you in the future. Thank you.